So I've heard that the Voice will be able to make decisions for all Australians. Why should the Voice make decisions for me? I think people haven't read what's been written about the Constitution. Can't we just legislate something? Why do we have to change the Constitution? So legislation?
Changeable.
From government to government. Whereas
The
Constitution, it's harder. That's why this is an important conversation.
As an Aboriginal person, we've seen too many times when something's been legislated for an advisory committee or a body, one party gets in, they get rid of it.
We've got a long history of advisory bodies or representative bodies set up under legislation. But what Parliament can set up under legislation, they can remove by legislation, and that's what's happened.
Permanency is a huge part of the Voice and why it's so important that we make this a constitutional amendment rather than just something that's made through legislation. I think, we've seen in the past representative bodies, advisory councils that have advised Parliament and they've not been permanent, they've been dismantled, they've been changed and they've been interfered with.
So if the Voice is there in the Constitution, it's protected. Its existence continues despite change in politics, despite the change in government. And the only way to get rid of it is to have another referendum.
I mean, our communities, our futures shouldn't be subject to party politics. They should be accountable to the communities they represent, and that's exactly what the Voice is going to do.
It's about recognition, longer term, throughout the history of the country, not something that's subject to changes in governments and changes in legislation.
This is fun, I like this. Okay. Won't the Voice just divide us and embed racism in the Constitution?
No.
Definitely not.
No, it won't.
We had racism in the Constitution, explicitly, excluding Aboriginal people in a couple of sections. And 1967 removed that, but it left us with a silence. So putting the Voice in the Constitution doesn't divide us, it brings us together.
It will enable a greater discussion about the history of racism in Australia, and also there'll be an opportunity for truth-telling, because we know that truth-telling, treaty and truth-telling is also what will follow.
This Voice and this constitutional change would actually work to make the Constitution more inclusive and more racially equitable.
I've heard that the Voice will be able to make decisions for all Australians and even tax us. Why should the Voice make decisions for me?
I think people haven't read what's been written about the Constitution.
I've heard this from people as well, that they're going to tax us, they do superannuation. It's a load of crap.
The Voice won't be making decisions. It's an advisory body. It'll advise government and Parliament about things that affect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. It can't tax anyone. It can't make a decision about anyone or for anyone. It's there to advise the government and Parliament.
It's about a voice, having Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples at the table when there are decisions that impact on them.
It's not about taking power away, it's not about making decisions for somebody else, and it certainly has very little to do with tax.
An advisory body will not have any impact on tax, property ownership. There's nothing to do with property. It's not going to come for your property. This is a myth that was put out there in the 1990s by the Coalition when land rights came out with Mabo.
Go whenever. There are many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Parliament now. Why do we need another mechanism when they already have representation?
Well, firstly, I'd say that there's no assurance that there would be people, Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander people in Parliament.
They could be voted out. And so how does that assure us, that we'll have representation there? And also people who are, say, voted in as senators represent their state. The Voice will actually be an opportunity for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to always be present in decisions about that affect them, right? So it's not about the representative politics in the same way.
But also the Voice is a different type of representation, right? It's for First Nations peoples across the country, the whole of Australia. And it's not going to be changing every 3 years, every time we have an election. It's a longer term representation.
I'm finding it all very confusing, so I think I'll just vote no.
This is a very simple, practical and positive change in the history of Australia. It's about turning a chapter in this nation's history. Vote yes, you'll change this nation's history. You'll give us the power to make our decisions and to close the gap. If you vote no, there is not going to be another vote. It's not going to be legislated. Nothing will change. We won't get treaty. It will all be scuffed. We need you to help us by voting yes. If you vote no or don't know, vote no, then nothing's going to change for us.
When you wake up the day after the referendum, do you want to know that you're on the side that chose to listen to First Nations people and to recognise them in our history? Or do you want to wake up the next day and know that you played a hand in voting down that opportunity?
And that sort of idea that nothing will change if you vote no is wrong. It will change. Either way, things will change.
This whole idea of I don't know, vote no is, I think, dangerous, damaging. It's wasting your vote. I think the real approach to this is don't know, find out. It's incumbent on every Australian to educate themselves about it, and it's not a difficult thing to find information on.
And with the line of you don't know, vote no, and with all the muddying of the water, that is a tactic that people are using to try and get you to vote no. I would recommend, reading the Uluru Statement from the Heart. It's 1 page long. If you don't know, the answer isn't vote no. If you don't know, the answer is to go find out.
The Constitution should be the same for all Australians. Why do we need to give one group special rights over everyone else?
Well, I mean, even with the Voice, the Constitution will still be for all Australians. It'll just be a Constitution that now represents the 80,000 years of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories, cultures and people. It will recognise our place, and I think that's something all Australians should be proud of.
Yeah, I don't see it as giving us special rights. It's actually acknowledging us as First Nations for starters and giving us an opportunity to actually make sure that what's needed for our community is actually advised to the government of the day. We've seen the close the gap targets forever, none of that's being met. If we have localised focus areas about that, it'll increase the health and wellbeing of our people, increase employment, education.
What it will do, it will address how the Constitution disproportionately impacted negatively on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples by recognising that it had the power to govern them in a different way to other Australians. So in a sense, this change will make things the same for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in ways that other peoples have enjoyed for centuries.
Isn't it undemocratic to have a group telling government what to do?
No. That we have so many groups telling the government what to do. We have the Reserve Bank deciding how inflation's going to happen. We have a whole bunch of we have the court system. They interpret the laws and they say, no, you can't do that.
The Voice will have no say to veto any laws. It is purely an advisory body to give recommendations, and it is a lot of fear-mongering.
We are just there to advise government bureaucrats, and they'll simply say to the advisory body, tell us what hasn't worked, why, what can we do better? And they'll give advice.
So no, it's actually democratic to give people a say in what the government does to them. And that's what the Voice is about. It's an advisory body to make representations to the government and Parliament about things that affect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And we have plenty of those kinds of bodies already, formal and informal.
I think it's really important to actually have that local area, so we get regional Australians get a voice, Aboriginal Australians, those in remote areas, and even those in Sydney. Like, we've got the most Aboriginal people in Western Sydney, and we need to have a voice about that area as well, and make sure that what's needed there is actually advised of government, so we can try and get the right funding, the right support mechanisms in place to change people's lives for the better.
Won't the Voice mean that sovereignty is ceded?
No, the Voice will not cede First Nations people's sovereignty.
The idea's been around for decades, but the modern movement and the movement that we're seeing now, finally with this referendum, started with the Uluru Statement of the Heart. If the Voice was going to take away First Nations sovereignty or take away First Nations rights, we would not be seeing the movement from First Nation elders and First Nation community members behind the voice.
I mean, the whole point of the Uluru Statement is talking about voice, treaty and truth. And I think the process was very particular in deciding how that should go. We need the Australian population to be able to hear us, to hear our voice before we can decide about those next steps. It's important that that's enshrined in the Constitution.
Not all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people agree with the voice. How can I say yes when there are so many saying no?
The architects of the voice are inviting you, the 97%, to, walk with us.
The majority of Aboriginal people.
That's right, walk with us. It's a generous, generous act, and we encourage people to consider it.
It's key to recognise that the majority of First Nations people are in support of this in some form. What form that actually takes will come through legislation, and that's when we have a real chance to listen to all of these differing opinions and make sure that this voice is something that the most amount of people possible can benefit from.
It's 3% of the population is Indigenous, which is not a lot. And so we need to be listening to the 80 to 85% of that 3% to help support, because everyone will be voting. Everyone will be voting to change the Constitution. That is how it works. We should be listening to the majority of people out of that group who it will most be impacting.
Wouldn't it be better to have a treaty first and then get a voice? Well, it's really interesting. We actually have treaties already at local, regional and state levels at different parts of the country. And those treaties were all set up after there was a structure like the Voice for those local, individual, Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander groups. And for people who want more treaties or maybe a national treaty, you actually need something like the Voice first to represent the First Nations groups who are going to negotiate with the government. And having a voice doesn't stop any more developments into the future. It's just one step to advise government and parliament. It doesn't stop a treaty happening in the future.
What the Uluru Statement from the Heart says is voice, treaty, truth. Treaties can be very useful in a context of legality and deciding who gets what. But I don't think we'd be in a position of deciding that unless there is this voice to inform the process for it. And with the voice, if it gets voted in, it won't be the end. There still needs to be treaty and truth. How do we know who the voice will be? Isn't it just giving the Aboriginal elites more power? How will I know that real communities are being heard?
So I think first to establish the Aboriginal elites, anybody who we call an Aboriginal elite, first of all, these people are only in the position they're in after decades of hard-won victories, a lot of protest and activism and advocacy has led to these First Nations leaders being in the position that they're in. And I think it's important that we recognise them not as elites, but as leaders, because that's who they are to us and that's who they are to their communities.
For me, I just want to know that our communities were able to come together, that we're able to have these conversations, and we're able to really think outside the box and think about what will Australia look like, after this referendum. Do we want an Australia that unifies and recognises First Peoples, or do we want an Australia that said no to recognising our voices? There is the power to really progress reconciliation, to create greater outcomes for our communities, and I think that power lies in the yes vote, that power lies in the voice.
Vote yes. I'm a guest on this land, Dungari woman from the Northern Rivers region on my mother's side, and my name is Jen Barrett. I am Pro Vice Chancellor, Indigenous academic here at the University of Sydney as well, working with colleagues such as Rick.
Hi, my name is Associate Professor Rick McCourt. I'm the Associate Dean for First Nations Strategy and Services here at the University. And I'm really happy to be here with Professor Jennifer Barrett to talk about The Voice.
Yamanindu, I'm Ethan Floyd. I'm a Wiradjuri Walewan person and I'm a student here at the University of Sydney.
I'm Alex Poirier and I am also a student. I'm the student president at the Conservatorium.
Hello, my name is Elisa Arcioni. I'm a constitutional law academic here at the Sydney Law School.
Jeremy Heathcote. I'm a proud Aboriginal man from the Wabakal Nation. I live on biomedical land and I work here at the University of Sydney as the Indigenous Community Health Engagement Officer.
Good day everyone, my name is Benjamin McGrory. I'm a proud Aboriginal man.
Hello, I'm Jack Scanlon, and we are both on the University of Sydney Student Representative Council.